It's rare that a video makes me so outright mad and insulted that I actually want to make a response to it. A few weeks ago, I made a video where I featured a short artsy clip because I wanted to cover a topic that specific video touched on. The video wasn't specifically about Yahtzee, but it was a crowbar to talk about a general issue. Then, 2 weeks after my video, this video by Nerrel came out. Originally, I didn't even watch the video until a friend of mine gave me a TLDR on the contents, and dear God. The video you are currently watching is a direct response to a video which has wasted an hour of my life and counting, saying some of the absolutely strangest anti-art takes I've ever seen, wrapped in a rather interesting salad of words. In his video, Nerrel misunderstands the very point of remakes, conflates fidelity and art direction, does not understand what depth of the author is, completely misinterprets what one specific game developer said, and then uses it to claim that, oh, all developers hated this or that, and so on. The video is an absolute unfocused train wreck, and I want to respond to it because it is just extremely infuriating to see this kind of anti-art take mere weeks after I released my own video defending the artistry in games. Obviously, don't go after people featured in these kinds of videos. In this specific case, being blatantly ignorant of art is punishment enough, I feel. The start of the video covers him talking about the backlash he got by arguing that a remake can objectively improve some aspects of a game. The issue with this kind of statement is the idea of objectively grading art. Well, there are more issues, but there's the first one. There are many modern games that use objectively higher resolution assets than older games, yet the older ones still tend to look leagues better than them. If you want a really simple example, compare Sonic 3 to Sonic 4, and you'll see what I mean. It's true that in an objective sense, Sonic 4 has an improved visual fidelity, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is how all of the game's factors come in and mesh with each other. The specific case of Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill Remake are a great example of how a far higher fidelity game can absolutely desecrate the art style of the original and still somehow manage to look worse. Nerrel seems to not actually like how the original Silent Hill 2 game feels and looks and controls, which is, something. Anyways, then Nerrel begins the video by talking about how Roger Ebert made an old-ass article on games not being art, while according to him, all movies are art. Now, this statement is so utterly stupid that it's not even really worth discussing, and this is the kind of statement that should immediately void your status as a movie critic, similarly to how it would be said that movies aren't art. Your status as a game critic should be completely void as well, though since those statuses aren't actually official, anyone can be a game or movie critic, we can't really void them. Having such disrespect for a medium that is basically across the pond from you shows a level of immaturity that can put the validity of all of your other takes into serious question. But I don't want to actually focus on this because Roger Ebert can't really go back on his claims as he has since passed away. However, speaking of movies, continuing on, Nerrel brings up the example of movies like the new Marvel stuff, or other movies that were made purely for tax reasons and then never released, and then claims that these specific examples of movies are not art. I am going to just show you this without any kind of argumentation against it because it is just blatantly stupid, and if I went on through the entire video and disagreed with every single little wrong, stupid thing in the video, I would have a 10-hour-long video that nobody would watch. Skipping forward, Nerrel decides to talk about some games like Metal Gear Solid 2 and Silent Hill 2 because, oh, they are definitely art, and how Ebert was wrong, and also the Silent Hill 2 movie was shit, therefore the game is better. Continuing from that, he talks about how interactivity just enhances games in ways that movies just can't be enhanced, and how Ebert completely misunderstood this. Continuing on, Nerrel talks about how interactivity can be buggy, or how sometimes that interactivity, once removed, can really take away from some games like in The Last of Us 2. And then, Nerrel brings up examples of industry veterans like Miyamoto or Kojima saying they're not artists or that the games they made are not art. This misses a very important point, that being the death of the author. The Death of the Author is a 1967 essay by a French dude called Roland Barthes, and he figured out something really important for us, that being that the author of a work and their intent matters less than the interpretation of the work by the audience. In the context of Metal Gear, maybe Kojima truly does not consider Metal Gear Solid 2 to be art, but as we at large consider it art, it's now art. Even if the designers of the game considered it just a game or thought it was degrading to make it instead of a movie, that doesn't mean the thing they created is not art. Michelangelo famously hated painting the Sistine Chapel. He thought himself of a sculptor and not a painter, and this was basically just being done to get a paycheck. Does this mean the paintings are any less artworthy than a painting that was designed to be art? There are so many examples of high art that have just flopped that you just can't really not bring this issue up. Meanwhile, people still talk about how great Mario Galaxy looks, a game that was probably not built with the idea of hanging up in a museum. Of course, Nerrel doesn't directly answer the question of if games are art or not, and instead claims that very few game creators consider games art, which is an appeal to authority, if I'm not mistaken, and directly contradicting the very idea of the death of the author. You'll find that throughout this entire video, Nerrel doesn't really stray from this idea, relying on the occasional developer quote, some of them not even actually being a quote but an incorrect paraphrase, in order to bolster his arguments, even if he is relying on an appeal to authority mixed with just forgetting about the death of the author. Next up, a common claim used by people who dislike remakes of games is that remaking a game is like redoing a Renaissance painting, but with modern brushes and tools. Nerrel, of course, disagrees with that assertion because they still look good, and argues that they were repaired and restored but not remade, and then claims a big reason not to remake these artworks is because no new advancements in painting technology that would warrant a remake have been made yet. Now, I'm not a painter, but I can assure you that even in the last 50 years, we've had drastic changes of how art is made and the technology behind that. We have new art styles that did not exist before, and that paramount to something that Nerrel, and I think a decent chunk of people in general, seem not to get. Each different console is basically its own art style. This is a product of its limitations, sure, and those limitations are what make art great. A sculpture is limited by the very material it is sculpted out of. A painting is limited by the colors available, the canvas sizes, the brushes that were available, and so on. Movies are limited by the medium they're shot on, the technology available, and all of this is heavily interwoven with technology, and all of it will end up affecting the end product in ways that are analogous to making a game for a specific console. The way that you make a PS1, PS2, or PS3 game requires very different techniques, methods, and understanding that are all kind of similar in a way that drawing in a minimalist, impressionist, or realist art form requires a completely different style and understanding of how to paint scenes. You need a different, though not necessarily unrelated, set of skills for all of these, and having access to different levels of technology may make one of them far easier than another. Nerrel then claims that an artist may make great assets, but that they're limited by the game's performance suffering. What he doesn't seem to get is that games are one big art piece, not some kind of art exhibit. In reality, a game lagging due to its overambition of its artist is paramount to a poorly paced movie with too many ideas, or a meandering book with 200 chapters. Of course, it's impossible to find a direct one-to-one comparison between such specific, intrinsic things of different mediums of art. But that's what makes every medium unique, with its own challenges and expectations. Games themselves have opportunities no other medium can get away with. A good RPG may be a 50-hour story with another 100 hours of side content, all of it packaged so well that you will love it for the full 150 hours. That level of engrossing you is something that no other medium of art can really do in the same way. Then there's a lot of technobabble here that I am going to skip, because I don't care for it. But in short, there's a lot of really weird stuff, like Nerrel basically comparing game engine tech to first painting with a shittier paintbrush and then deciding to remake the painting with a modern paintbrush, except that paintbrush technology literally went through this exact same series of events throughout history, so he's making an argument that kind of relies on you not realizing that the paintbrush has evolved over the last 500 years. Then continuing on, Nerrel talks about how inconsistent frame rates are issues in movies but are often looked over in games, apparently once more not understanding the difference between different mediums of art. And then this goes on for some time. Nerrel's big criticism of Star Fox is that while a lot of the aesthetic choices the game uses for performance reasons do end up looking good, it's held back by its frame rate and D-pad controls. And yes, from a modern day perspective, Star Fox runs slower than most games should with a control scheme most games would not use, but to claim Star Fox would instantly be a better game if it used an analog stick or ran at a fluid 60 frames just kind of missed the point. The game was designed to run that way. It's balanced around it, similarly to how removing tank controls from Tomb Raider wouldn't exactly instantly make the game super appealing to newbies. In the same way, giving Star Fox the performance and aiming of Panzer Dragoon 2 would not inherently improve how the game felt to play. It might become too easy, which is something which can happen when, for instance, a game is brought from the joystick to a mouse or pointer system, which is what happened with Sin and Punishment on the Wii. And yes, developers did not choose for Star Fox to run at such low frame rates, but just as a TV series in the 1990s had to make its visuals fit a 4:3 aspect ratio, 480 line, 60 field per second format output, and then worked within those limitations, or manga artists had to work within the same limits of what their machines could physically print, Nintendo, and basically every other game developer in existence, had to work within their limitations of what their platform supported, what was in their budget, and so on. Continuing on, Nerrel talks about how increasing a game's resolution is an objective upgrade when that's clearly not the case. Ico's developers, for instance, decided to specifically make their game run at 240p even if 480p was available and the resolution almost every single PS2 game used. Similarly, almost all developers who made games for consoles made all of their assets look the best in their game's native resolution or frame rate. Many PS1 and N64 games look like utter dog shit in 4K widescreen while looking great in their original intended resolutions. This is partially because there are many optimizations and blemishes whose effects and side effects are just not visible at the native resolution, or maybe they're obscured by the game's native FOV, but when you upscale them, they become far more visible and make the game look far less cohesive and worse. Nerrel also thinks that there's a separation between a game's art and programming, which to me implies a fundamental misunderstanding of what programming is and how it meshes together with art. Coding is a form of art, not in the sense that it's art for art's sake, but as functional art, similarly to architecture or interior design. It's not about how the code looks. To non-coders at least, there are plenty of pieces of code that make me a little bit too excited, but in the way that the code's impact is felt in the thing it's supposed to support. You don't notice good interior design choices, only the bad ones, similarly to how you only notice bad coding and not good coding. You don't notice the internal support structure of a beautiful looking bridge, only its outward appearance and function, until it collapses, and then you read about how it's poorly designed. Coding works in a similar way. There's also a poorly thought out jab at the OG Silent Hill 2 game that I don't want to get into because it would derail the video. Nerrel here makes a point about how many retro-inspired games are not properly retro. Or, well, basically most of the games we see as retro don't actually follow every single limitation the old games have. This is of course because artists today have taken aspects of stuff like 5th generation graphics and have then turned it into their own interpretation of the art form. Kind of like how neoclassical art mimics classical art in a way that is still distinct from it. This has happened with both 3rd and 4th generation games, but Nerrel, instead of talking about that, just complains that nobody wants a 15 FPS game, which is true in a similar sense to how almost nobody today wants a silent film or black and white film, but that doesn't inherently devalue the old works or means that they have to be remade in color and sound in order to be enjoyable. Now here comes the point where he's interviewing developers of an indie N64-inspired platformer, and there's a lot of weird stuff like the developers hating on Mario 64's movement, but not much really happens here, until a little bit later on, bewilderingly, Nerrel decides to take a quote from Koji Sugimoto out of context, and kind of misinterpret and run with it. Basically, Sugimoto, the guy who was behind the programming of a lot of Final Fantasy games during the PS1 and PS2 era, said that he spent countless hours upon hours trying to make the PS1's texture warping seem less and less noticeable, and that to him it was quite surprising that people wanted to actively recreate those imperfections in the indie games that are inspired by PS1 games because they found them charming. He then went into detail about his experience making PS1 games. Now, Nerrel took a part of the statement and somehow inferred that Sugimoto called the entirety of PS1 graphics detestable. How he came up with that, I have no idea. But he does show an example of RE1 zoomed in and upscaled, a situation that is not how the game naturally works, as it looks quite good in its native 240p resolution, as do most PS1 games with pre-rendered backgrounds, and it's only this need to upscale the games in 4K that ends up making the backgrounds and models seem off while they look coherent and cohesive in their intended resolutions. Anyways, Nerrel uses that incorrect, made-up extrapolation of Sugimoto's argument as a claim that developers generally hated PS1 graphics, and secondly, he uses that conjecture to claim that those graphics were a hindrance, and then finally states the only reason for these visuals is nostalgia, and in order for something to be art, there just needs to be something more than nostalgia. His entire argument for this, as stupid as the argument is, hinges on a single misinterpreted developer Twitter post, and then uses that to claim that all developers thought the way that one developer did, even if he was misinterpreted, and that the only reason anyone would like this style is nostalgia. What the fuck? Then again, in the interview, they talk about how the whole reason many PS1-inspired horror games run at 20 FPS or use polygon distortion or wobble is not actually because of any cinematic or aesthetic reasons, why would there be, but purely because, oh, they just want to make the game seem like it's old, or because the graphics are old and unfamiliar and will then creep you out more. Now, this may just be my opinion, but as somebody who has played with low-poly graphics for the fun of it, I think this is flat-out insulting to the artists who have made those games. To take their actual choices in design and dumb them down to, oh, they just want to make it look older so it seems like it's made back in the day is honestly just kind of offensive. And then after this, Nerrel goes back to his still wrong statement of how games are truly limited by technology, but movies were only limited by the skill of the artist. The next segment of the video talks about how sometimes newer tech can make movies worse, and then he turns around and claims that because newer technology is objectively faster, that means that games that take advantage of this newer hardware are objectively better. He then turns around and claims the 4th generation, while also limited, aged like fine wine, which is fucking hilarious, because the developers perfected their visions. This is absolutely hilarious, considering that Star Fox was a 4th generation game, and more importantly, does not even consider the fact that many developers wanted to make 3D adventures for ages, but the technology just wasn't really there to allow for such tech. Sonic 3 was originally envisioned as some sort of isometric 3D game, but then Sega held off on it because they realized the tech wasn't just there yet. He then also claims that 16-bit games have far more appeal than early 3D games, which is an interesting point considering DS and PSP games were basically just an extension of that early 3D art style for another decade, and that the 5th generation of Pokemon has 2D characters in a 3D world style, which is not too far from something like Xenogears, and specifically the 5th generation of Pokemon is one of the most beloved by a lot of the fanbase. How come if the games look so ugly? I don't know. Then there's also the claim here that remakes of 4th generation games get colder receptions than remakes of 5th generation games, pointing out Secret of Mana and how the ugliest SNES games are the ones that were faking 3D. Of course, this remake argument ignores how many fans still despise RE3 Remake and how many of them are not happy with the other RE remakes, or Final Fantasy VII Remake, or the fans that are happy with the Mario RPG Remake. It's just more cherry-picking, ending with the claim that, oh, what the artists wanted was barely achievable on 5th generation hardware, as if many ambitious 4th generation developers did not push the 4th generation consoles to their absolute limits, routinely slamming into limits that the 5th generation of gaming would solve, like file size restrictions, music quality, colors on screen, transparency, 3D asset usage, and more. And now for the most horribly stupid take I've seen in a while. Nerrel claims that you might claim these limitations are a part of the art, but these workarounds, like pre-rendered backgrounds in the old RE games, actively made the games worse and age worse because now they look worse once upscaled, once they are removed from the original context the games were designed for. And then he goes into a spiel about how CRTs suck, scanline filters are finicky, and it's paramount to expecting everyone to have projectors for films in their rooms instead of watching them digitally, completely missing the point that these games were designed to look a specific way. He then continues to compare movies and games in ways that are really not comparable, saying that the limiting factor in movies was not the movie itself, but the thing it was being watched on, and extrapolating from that games were limited by the things they were on, and that therefore they deserve to just be upscaled and played at super high resolutions and remade differently. RE1 is a very interesting case for this specific line because developers were originally going to make the game in a first-person perspective, only switching to the fixed camera angles after they thought it would be a cool and cinematic way to set up their games. And once they did that, they realized they could have striking camera angles designed to set up scenes in ways only movies can really have, not showing you what's behind a corner until you actually come near it, that sort of stuff. It just wouldn't have been possible without those system limitations, giving them reasons to seek out other ideas and solutions for their problems. Nerrel then continues to talk about how using different modded inputs for older games doesn't necessarily change how the games work, except they definitely do, because you're not meant to be juking zombies in your first playthrough of RE1, and RE4 was specifically designed for you stopping and aiming every time you want to shoot a zombie. That's how it was designed. He then enters a segment where he talks about how much fans wanted remakes, as if remake culture is something exclusive to games these days. There are many articles talking about remake culture and how it has damaged gaming, film, TV, and other mediums of art. But Nerrel instead decides to talk about how the only good movie remakes are the ones that share basic plot points with the original, while old games are hard to come back to, and therefore need to be one-to-one remade so you can have a definitive experience, while the older one is left in the past. How the hypocrisy of this statement is not lost on him, I have no clue, but if I need to spell it out for you, this is something that many of us have been saying about game remakes for a while. The best remakes of games are the ones that take the original concept of something and then reinterpret it in a new way, preserving value for both the original work and the remake. This is what the remake of RE2 does. It's what the Final Fantasy VII remake does, and it's what Metroid Zero Mission does. It's the best and most respectful way to remake games. Of course, Nerrel then turns around and talks about the downsides of remaking a game like Mario 3 1-to-1 in All-Stars because it's more visually generic, and that a lot of remakes or remasters just have a shit ton of bugs and general incompetence due to various development reasons. He then says that it's not as big of a problem if a new director remakes the same movie because, games are split across hundreds of individuals and games take some assets from stock sources anyways, so it doesn't matter. As if movies don't take assets from stock sources, and if movies don't have hundreds of people working on them. Anyways, then he claims that it's a good thing to have basically played the original games once you play a remake, because to him, the original game is an imperfect thing that must be cast into the depths, into the abyss, replaced with a more perfect replica. To give these old games a second chance with good rendering by throwing them away. And this is where the video goes entirely off the rails, and with it so will I. Nerrel, in his infinite wisdom, then goes on to claim that if you want the games to be reimaginings and not just one-to-one replicas, you just don't see games as art and are actually instead anti-art, which is absolutely fucking absurd. art is not there to exist in a static form to be admired. It is to be interpreted. That is the point of art. To claim that all art is static is actually very, very anti-art. Instead, you should want developers to reinterpret their work in a new, unique light, so that those new, unique experiences can be crafted from that, instead of just continuously retreading the same fucking ground with better visuals. Nerrel, of course, disagrees, and uses the 2010 GoldenEye game as an example of what happens when a game is reimagined instead of remade, and gestures at Resident Evil 3 Remake and the yellow paint in Final Fantasy 7 Remake instead of actually diving into what made those remakes controversial to some people. He then talks about how, oh, you can't just reimagine Ocarina of Time because it would turn into Twilight Princess, and that it would have been impossible to turn Snake Eater Delta into an open world game, missing the point of why people want those reimaginings entirely. I think it's funny mentioning remaking Ocarina of Time because Nintendo took Zelda 1 and sort of reimagined it into Breath of the Wild. And I'm not a fan of Breath of the Wild, but like, a lot of people are, so I don't think he knows what he's talking about there. Anyways, he then turns around and specifically shits on RE2 and RE3 because Capcom didn't really care for the originals until GOG asked them to publish the originals on their platform. Why he thinks a corporation not considering publishing a specific older piece of art has any value on the art itself, I do not know. Hey, editing me here. During the editing process, I found an interview with Capcom's head producer, Peter Fabiano, after the release of the remakes of RE2 and RE3, where he basically stated that the originals and the remakes, in a canonical sense, exist simultaneously, and that they're just different ways of depicting the same events. So that's an extra argument in the fact that Capcom not giving that much of a shit as a corporation in regards to their old video games doesn't mean that the people working on those video games, the people producing them, the people writing the stories, that they don't care about them, or that they don't like them, or that they're not, you know, continuing their legacy. It's just the corporation is being stupid again. Please separate the artists from the corporation funding them, I guess. Anyways, Nerrel really dislikes the RE2 remake, specifically because it's not like the older games, and is instead reimagining them in a new style. I know there are arguments about this and that, but the actual core of the argument is that Nerrel wants Capcom to remake the old games one-to-one, treating the originals as immovable obelisks of game design, once more completely missing the value of letting a new team try out an older idea. He instead complains that because you did not experience the original games when you played the remakes, there was no point in remaking them, once more simply not understanding the point of these games. The video then begins to meander at the end, basically continuing to reiterate the last 2 points, complaining about Zero Mission, and claiming that you should not want to reimagine something and to either demand a new thing entirely, or to remake a one-to-one remake of the old thing. This then devolves into a spiel about how games are modern enough to not need to be remade because of diminishing returns, and then the video concludes with how you can't have a remake of an influential game and still have it be as influential as the old one, that the fans can sometimes do a better job, and that people sometimes want remakes of games because they're bad, basically asking for a fixed version. Why he did not cover something like Project 06 in the video if he was gonna mention that at the end, I don't know. And the final point, he wants developers to agree on what remakes are supposed to be, as if agreeing on what a form of art is supposed to be has ever led to something good, before proceeding to complain about how people always get mad at his takes and he doesn't actually seem to get what people are mad at. Then the video ends, but mine hasn't yet, because I have to end my video now. And what is there to say that hasn't already been said? Nerrel just doesn't understand how a decent chunk of the technical stuff behind the art forms works, and I feel he also doesn't get how art works generally, and I feel like his entire video is kind of a big hit piece on himself. His video parrots existing anti-art takes about games, and seeing his general perspective on all of this is kind of bewildering. He argues for going 100% by the original author's vision, but not once does he consider the original low resolutions, aspect ratios, or controls as a part of that vision. He has a very binary view of art and limitation in a way that I feel is absurdly reductive and honestly offensive to the designers. That friend from the very beginning of the video brought up a brilliant point that I want to end this video on. A lot of people don't take into account that intent is based on material conditions. No one in the days of the Atari 2600 had the artistic intent to create a third-person shooter with an over-the-shoulder camera and a cover system because it just wasn't ever in the scope of the material conditions to even consider it. This same thing is true for games developed with a smaller scope in later developments, such as the early 3D era, but people don't treat them the same way. I feel that this idea of greater intent is why nobody really imagines that Nintendo intended for Mario World to look like Rayman Legends, because people accepted pixel art and such as an art style, but with early 3D stuff, it seems like people just don't see it as such. Also, artists can retrospectively apply their intent to new ideas, but if the conditions don't exist to enable those ideas, then they just aren't possible. Look, at the end of the day, Nerrel's video is a train wreck, and it's just overall an anti-art video that I feel is held back gaming for another 5 years. Yeah, more anti-art discourse, more, oh, our game's actually art, more people demanding whatever. I'm here for it. This is sort of where the video ends. I'm going back to playing Atelier as Rihanna instead of actually working on videos or any videos. Bye.